Richard Hale was a man everyone in the city knew by name. He owned several companies, lived in a huge mansion on the hill, and appeared in newspapers as one of the most successful businessmen in the region. People called him a man of discipline, a man who controlled everything around him. But behind the tall gates of his mansion there was something no one knew. There was a part of his life that he never allowed the world to see. Inside that mansion lived his only daughter, Emily. She was a quiet, gentle girl with soft brown hair and big blue eyes that always seemed to look far away. Emily had been different since birth. She didn't talk much, avoided loud sounds, and liked to line up her toys perfectly in a row. She found comfort in order and silence. While most children played outside, Emily preferred the calm of her own space. The doctors told Richard that Emily had autism, and that she would need extra care, patience, and understanding. Richard didn't handle the news well. His wife Grace had been the calm voice in their home. She was the one who understood Emily's world. She used to sit with her for hours, humming gentle songs and smiling as Emily rocked back and forth in rhythm. But when Grace passed away suddenly in an accident, Richard's world collapsed. He became colder, quieter, and more distant. He didn't know how to care for Emily the way Grace did. He didn't understand her silences, her sudden tears, or her need for routine. In his fear of losing control, Richard made a terrible mistake. He turned his home into a fortress, believing that if he could just keep Emily safe inside, nothing bad would happen to her. He locked the doors, set up cameras, and built a special room for her. Not a prison, but it felt like one. It was clean and filled with her favorite things, books, soft toys, and the soft yellow light she liked. But it also had locks on the outside, and that was what made it wrong. Richard told himself it was for her protection. He told himself the world outside was too noisy, too confusing, too dangerous for someone like her. But deep down, even he knew that he wasn't protecting her. He was hiding her. Every morning, Richard would walk past her room without looking inside. He couldn't bear to face what he had done. He would stand in his office, staring at the city skyline, trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. But at night, when the house was quiet, the guilt would come back. He would sometimes hear Emily humming softly from her room, a song that Grace used to sing, and his chest would tighten. But instead of opening the door, he would just sit there, listening through the wall, letting the sound break him in silence. The only one who went inside Emily's room freely was Max, the German shepherd. Max had been a gift from Grace before she passed away. He was strong, intelligent, and loyal, a dog that understood emotions better than most humans. When Emily was upset, Max would sit beside her, resting his head on her lap. When she smiled, he wagged his tail gently as if he knew she was trying. He became her best friend, her comfort, and her only link to the outside world. Every day, Max waited outside Emily's locked door. He would lie down there for hours, refusing to move, even when the maids tried to call him away. It was as if he was standing guard, not against danger but against loneliness. He could sense what Richard refused to see, that the girl inside that room didn't need to be hidden. She needed love, understanding, and freedom. One quiet morning, while Richard was having breakfast, Max came running into the dining hall, his paws clicking sharply on the marble floor. He barked once, then twice, as if trying to get Richard's attention. Richard frowned, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Max?" he said, putting down his coffee cup. Max ran toward the hallway and looked back at him, whining softly. It wasn't the first time the dog had done this, but something in his tone that morning made Richard stand up. He followed Max upstairs, the dog's nails tapping on each step. When they reached Emily's room, Max began scratching the door. Richard unlocked it and stepped inside. Emily sat on the floor, humming quietly and running her fingers through Max's fur. She looked up for a second, her eyes distant but calm. The room was clean, everything in perfect order. Her books lined neatly, her toys placed carefully on the shelves. It looked peaceful, but Richard could feel something missing. The air felt heavy, lifeless. Max walked around the room, then stopped near the corner wall where a painting had fallen face down. He barked once, startling Richard. The painting had been there for years, untouched. Richard bent down, lifted it, and froze. It was a portrait of Grace holding baby Emily. The edges were dusty, but the colors still glowed. Grace's face looked warm, alive, full of love. Emily's tiny hand in the painting was reaching toward her mother's cheek. Richard stared at it for a long time. His throat felt dry. For a moment, he could almost hear Grace's laughter, the way she used to fill the house with life. Max sat beside him watching quietly. Emily's soft humming filled the room again. It was the same tune Grace used to sing to her at bedtime. Richard's eyes began to sting. He set the painting down gently and sat on the floor beside Max, something he hadn't done in years. He didn't say a word, but his heart was breaking in a way he hadn't allowed it to for a long time. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He walked around the house, stopping near Emily's door. Max was lying there again, eyes open, ears perked. The dog looked up at him, and for a second Richard felt as if the animal could read his thoughts. He whispered softly, "You think I've done the right thing, don't you?" Max tilted his head slightly but stayed silent. Richard sighed and sat on the floor beside him. Through the door he could hear Emily humming again, that same slow, gentle melody. Memories came flooding back. Grace sitting by the piano, Emily in her arms, sunlight streaming through the window. The laughter, the hope, the dream of a perfect family. It all seemed so far away now, buried under years of fear and mistakes. Richard pressed his hand against the wall near Emily's room, whispering quietly, "I'm sorry." He didn't know if she could hear him, but Max seemed to understand. The dog gently rested his paw on Richard's knee, as if offering silent forgiveness. From that night onward, something began to change inside Richard. He started spending more time at home, canceling meetings, sitting near the hallway where Emily's room was. Sometimes he would bring Max's food bowl there and stay beside him, listening to Emily's quiet voice through the door. He began to realize how much he had missed, the sound of her small footsteps, her laughter when Max did something silly, her humming when she was calm. One afternoon, he found Max sitting at the window, staring at the garden outside. The dog's reflection looked lonely, almost human. Richard followed his gaze and saw a small patch of sunlight falling on the grass, the same place where Grace used to sit with Emily years ago. That memory hit him like a wave. He suddenly understood what Max had been trying to show him all along. His daughter didn't need to be locked away. She needed to feel the world again, even if it was just sunlight and wind. As the evening sky turned golden, Richard walked back to Emily's door. He stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the cold handle. Inside, Emily was humming softly and Max wagged his tail, sensing his hesitation. Richard whispered, "Tomorrow maybe," and turned away. But something had changed in his eyes. For the first time in years, there was a spark of warmth, the beginning of a father remembering what love truly meant. Every morning began the same way. The large mansion woke in silence and sunlight crept slowly through the long curtains. The staff moved quietly through the hallways, careful not to make a sound. But the only one who seemed truly alive in that house was Max, the German shepherd. As soon as he heard Emily's gentle humming from her room, his tail began to move. It was the one sound that made him happy. Richard often watched Max from his office window. The dog would sit outside Emily's door every single day, waiting patiently for hours. Sometimes Max would lie down with his nose pressed against the floor, as if listening to her from under the door. Other times he would rest his head on his paws and close his eyes, just waiting. Richard couldn't understand why Max was so attached to her. "She doesn't even talk to you," he would mumble to himself. But he didn't know that the quiet bond between them didn't need words. Inside her room, Emily always sat near the corner by the window, where sunlight touched the carpet in a soft circle. That was her favorite spot. She would hum softly, touch the light with her fingers, and sometimes toss a little rubber ball toward Max through the small space under the door. Max always rolled it back gently, never breaking the game. It was their silent way of saying, "I'm here." One morning, something unusual happened. Richard was reading the newspaper at the dining table when Max came running in. His fur was a little dusty and he had something in his mouth and a folded piece of paper. Richard frowned, took it from him, and opened it. It was one of Emily's old drawings, a simple sketch done in crayon, a picture of a family, a man, a woman, a little girl, and a big dog standing beside them. Above them, a crooked sun smiled down. Richard stared at the picture for a long time. It was from years ago, before Grace had passed away. He remembered Emily sitting on the floor with her crayons while Grace laughed softly behind her. Max barked once, as if to pull him back to the present. Richard looked at the dog and sighed. You still remember her too, don't you? He whispered. Max wagged his tail, but his eyes looked sad as if he truly did. Later that day, Richard decided to take Max outside for a walk. It had been months since they had gone out together. The garden was covered in golden leaves and the air smelled fresh. Max sniffed the ground, wagging his tail happily. For a moment, Richard felt something light in his heart, a memory of simpler days. When they returned, Max ran straight upstairs, back to Emily's room. Richard followed him quietly. When he reached the hallway, he saw something that made him stop. Max was scratching the door softly with his paw, whining. Emily's humming had stopped. Richard hesitated, then gently unlocked the door. Emily was sitting in the corner with her head resting on her knees. She wasn't crying, but her shoulders moved slightly and her eyes looked distant. When Max walked in, she lifted her head and whispered something so faint that Richard almost missed it. Max. It was the first word he had heard her speak in months. Richard stood still, stunned. His heart began to beat faster. Emily looked at Max and reached out her hand. The dog walked over slowly and rested his head in her lap. She stroked his fur gently, her lips moving again, whispering something only he could understand. For the first time, Richard saw her truly connected to someone. He felt something heavy lift from his chest. After that day, Richard started spending more time near Emily's room. He would bring his laptop into the hallway and work there while Max lay beside him. Sometimes he could hear Emily humming softly, and every time Max wagged his tail, Richard found himself smiling without even realizing it. The sound of her voice, even if only a hum, began to bring warmth back into the cold walls of the house. One afternoon, Richard walked into Emily's room to bring her a tray of food. He rarely did this himself, and the maids usually handled it, but today he wanted to. Emily was sitting on the floor drawing again. Max sat beside her, watching carefully. She didn't look up when he entered, but she didn't flinch either. That small detail made him hopeful. He placed the tray on the table and looked at her drawings. They were all the same. Circles of light, clouds, trees, and always a dog beside a girl. You like drawing, Max, don't you? He said softly. Emily didn't answer but smiled faintly. Richard's throat tightened. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her smile. It was small, fragile, but it was real. That night, Richard sat in his study, staring at the old painting of Grace and Emily that Max had found earlier. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Grace's voice echoed in his memory, gentle, kind, full of faith. He remembered how she used to say, "She doesn't need fixing, Richard. She needs understanding." He had never really understood what that meant until now. Watching Emily and Max together had shown him that love didn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it was quiet and patient, like Max's loyalty. The next few days, Richard began to change small things in the house. He asked the maids not to keep the curtains closed all the time. He told them to leave the windows slightly open in the morning so sunlight could reach Emily's hallway. Slowly, the air in the house began to feel different, less heavy, more alive. Max seemed to sense it too. He barked more, ran around more freely, and stayed beside Emily even longer. One evening, Richard returned home early from work. The mansion was unusually quiet, but there was a soft sound coming from upstairs, laughter. He froze. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was laughter. He walked up slowly and saw Emily sitting near the open door of her room, Max lying beside her with a ball between his paws. She was laughing softly as Max nudged the ball toward her. Richard stood there, not wanting to interrupt. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a home. Later that night, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He sat on the couch, lost in thought. Max walked up and rested his head on Richard's knee. Richard patted him gently. "You're changing everything, aren't you, boy?" he whispered. The dog wagged his tail, eyes filled with quiet wisdom. Richard smiled sadly. "You're teaching me what I forgot, how to love without fear." The following morning, Richard woke up early. He walked to Emily's room and stood outside. Through the half-open door, he saw her asleep, with Max lying beside her like a guard. The sunlight touched both of them softly. Richard leaned against the doorframe, watching them for a long time. He realized how wrong he had been all those years, locking her away, calling it protection. She hadn't needed walls. She had needed connection. That day, Richard took an old family photo from the drawer, one of Grace, Emily, and himself, and placed it on Emily's table. When she saw it later, she picked it up and stared at it quietly. Her fingers traced Grace's face, then moved toward Richard's. She didn't say a word, but her eyes softened. Max barked once, breaking the silence. Richard looked at her and said softly, "That's your mom. She loved you very much." Emily nodded faintly, still holding the picture. The bond between them began to rebuild slowly, day by day. Richard started reading books about autism, learning how to communicate with her in ways that didn't rely on words. He learned to wait, to listen, and to be patient. And through it all, Max stayed by their side, the bridge between father and daughter. In the evenings, when the sun went down, Richard would sit in the garden with Emily and Max. Emily would watch the butterflies or count the stars while Max lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. Sometimes Richard would look at her and whisper to himself, "Grace, you were right." The air would grow quiet, peaceful, as if Grace herself was there, smiling at them from somewhere beyond the light. As days turned into weeks, Richard began to realize something deeper. Max hadn't just been protecting Emily all those years. He had been waiting for Richard to find his heart again. The dog had known long before anyone else that the little girl behind that locked door was not a burden. She was the only piece of innocence left in that house, the part of his life that could still save him, and slowly, gently, she was doing just that. The weather changed without warning that week. Heavy clouds gathered over the city, covering the sky like a dark blanket. The wind howled through the trees and the air felt thick, almost electric. Richard stood by his office window, watching as the first drops of rain splashed against the glass. He didn't like storms. They reminded him of the night he lost Grace. Every flash of lightning brought back the sound of sirens and the helplessness he had buried deep inside his heart. Down the hall, Max paced nervously in front of Emily's door. Dogs could always sense when something was about to happen. His ears twitched every time thunder rumbled. Inside her room, Emily sat on her bed, her hands pressed tightly against her ears. She hated loud sounds. Thunder always frightened her. Max barked once softly, trying to comfort her from the other side of the door, but the storm only grew louder. Richard sighed and closed the curtains. He had spent the whole day trying to distract himself with work, but his mind kept drifting to Emily and Max. In the last few weeks, everything had started to change. He had begun to spend more time near her, and sometimes she would even let him sit quietly in the corner of her room while she drew. He didn't speak much, but she didn't seem to mind his presence anymore. The walls between them were slowly falling, one quiet day at a time. But that night, something unexpected happened, something that neither of them could have planned. Around 9 p.m., lightning struck somewhere close to the mansion. The lights flickered twice and then went out completely. The house was suddenly swallowed by darkness. The humming sound of electricity died, and in the silence that followed, a soft beep echoed from the security panel near Emily's room. The electronic locks clicked and released. Max barked sharply, sensing the change. He ran toward the control panel and barked again, his tail moving anxiously. Inside her room, Emily froze. The door had never opened by itself before. She looked at it wide-eyed, her heart beating fast. For a moment, she didn't move. The thunder roared again, and a flash of lightning lit up the room through the window. Emily whimpered softly, whispering something under her breath that only she could hear. Downstairs, Richard tried to find a flashlight. "Max," he called, but his voice was drowned out by the storm. He grabbed his phone, but even the signal was gone. Rain lashed against the windows like waves crashing against the shore. Somewhere above him, Max barked again, louder this time. Richard felt a rush of panic. He hurried up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the dark hallway. Meanwhile, Max nudged Emily's door with his nose until it opened a little wider. Emily stared at the gap in silence. Her world had always been that room, the soft yellow walls, the window, the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Beyond that door was something she didn't understand. But Max looked at her and wagged his tail gently as if telling her, "It's okay." Emily took a small step forward. The floor outside felt different, cooler, smoother. She hesitated, holding the door frame for balance. Max stayed close, brushing his fur against her hand. Another flash of lightning filled the hallway and she flinched, pressing herself closer to him. Max barked once, softly, and then began walking slowly down the hall, turning his head to make sure she was following. It was the first time in years that Emily had been outside her room. The hallway felt huge, endless, and filled with strange shadows from the lightning outside. Her bare feet made soft sounds against the floor as she followed Max, one small step at a time. Her breathing was fast, but Max's calm presence made her feel braver. When they reached the main staircase, the wind from a broken window blew through the hall. The rain had found its way in, and puddles were forming on the marble floor. Max barked once, alerting Richard, who was coming up from below with a flashlight in his hand. The beam of light caught Emily's small figure standing beside Max at the top of the stairs. Richard froze. For a second, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His daughter, the same girl he had locked away for years, was standing there free, trembling but calm. The flashlight shook in his hand. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. Emily didn't move. She looked down at him, eyes wide but curious. Max stood between them, wagging his tail slowly, glancing at both as if he was proud of something. Richard took a careful step forward. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said softly. "You're safe." Lightning flashed again and the thunder made her flinch. Max barked once and nudged her leg, guiding her gently toward the bottom of the stairs. Richard stepped aside, letting them come down at their own pace. Each step felt like a miracle, a quiet moment that would stay in his memory forever. When she finally reached the ground floor, Emily stopped in front of the large glass doors that opened to the garden. The rain outside poured heavily, and the wind howled through the cracks. She stared at it, her face lit by the faint glow of the lightning. She raised her hand slowly, pressing it against the cold glass. For years, she had only seen the rain through her window. Now it was right there, just a few steps away. Richard walked closer, afraid to speak. He didn't want to break the moment. He could see her reflection in the glass, her face soft, eyes wide, hair slightly messy. Max stood beside her, his head tilted slightly upward, his tail wagging gently. Together they looked like two souls discovering the world for the first time. Without thinking, Richard reached out and unlocked the door. The sound made Emily turn toward him suddenly, but when he opened it just a little, she didn't back away. The cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and fresh rain. Emily's eyes lit up. She stepped closer, feeling the wind on her face. A small smile appeared on her lips, the kind that could melt even the hardest heart. She stretched her hand out into the rain. For a second, she just let the drops fall onto her palm, watching them with amazement. Max barked softly, wagging his tail, then stepped out into the rain himself. He looked back at her, waiting. Emily laughed, a soft, short laugh, and followed him. The rain soaked her hair and her nightdress, but she didn't care. She spun slowly once, lifting her face to the sky, feeling the raindrops fall on her cheeks like 1,000 tiny stars. Richard stood in the doorway, his heart full. He hadn't seen her this free, this alive, since she was a baby. For a long moment, he couldn't move. He just watched her, his little girl who had been locked away by his own fear, standing under the open sky with a loyal dog beside her. The rain washed away years of guilt that he had carried like a heavy chain. When Emily looked back at him, she smiled again and waved softly. It was small and shy, but it was enough. Richard felt tears in his eyes. He stepped out into the rain too, not caring about his expensive clothes or cold shoes. He walked slowly toward her. Max barked and ran in circles around them, his fur dripping but his eyes bright with joy. Emily reached out and touched her father's hand. It was the first time she had willingly touched him in years. He froze for a second, then gently held her hand in his. Neither spoke, but everything that needed to be said was there. In that one simple touch. The storm still raged above them, but it no longer felt frightening. It felt cleansing. The rain fell harder. The thunder rolled across the hills, and yet all Richard could feel was peace. He looked down at Emily, who was still smiling faintly, and whispered, "You're free now." Max barked once, as if agreeing, and then sat beside them both, watching the rain fall. For the first time in years, the mansion no longer felt like a cage. It felt alive, filled with light, sound, and hope. That night, when the storm finally passed, Richard tucked Emily into her bed without locking the door. Max lay beside her, his head resting on his paws. Before leaving the room, Richard looked back and whispered softly, "Thank you, Max." Downstairs, as he stood by the window, he could still hear the faint sound of rain outside and the soft rhythm of his daughter's breathing upstairs. He smiled to himself. It was the sound of freedom, fragile, pure, and finally real. The morning after the storm, sunlight touched the mansion for the first time in what felt like forever. It slipped quietly through the windows, lighting up the hallways that had once been filled with shadows. The smell of wet grass drifted in through the open windows, and the air felt new, soft, and peaceful. Richard woke early. He stood by his bedroom window, looking out at the garden below. Drops of rain still clung to the leaves, shining like small pearls. Max was already outside, running across the grass, chasing the butterflies that came out after the storm. For a moment, Richard just smiled. It was a small smile, but it felt strange and real. Then he remembered the night before. Emily stepping out into the rain, her laughter, her smile, the way she looked up at the sky. The memory made his chest feel warm and heavy at the same time. It was the moment he realized he had been wrong all those years. The walls, the locks, the silence, and none of it had kept her safe. It had only kept her away from the world she needed to feel. He went upstairs and stopped at Emily's door. For years it had been locked from the outside, but now it was open. The lock hung loosely, and the morning sunlight fell softly across the doorway. Inside, Emily was still asleep, curled up with Max beside her. The dog's tail moved slightly, as if even in sleep he was happy to be there. Richard stood quietly for a long time watching them. He had never seen such peace on her face. Later that morning, when Emily woke up, she looked around her room with a new kind of curiosity. The window was open, and she could hear the sound of birds outside. She smiled faintly and touched the sunlight that poured through the window pane. Max wagged his tail, nudging her hand gently. For the first time, she looked out and didn't seem afraid. Richard walked in slowly with a tray of breakfast, pancakes, strawberries, and warm milk. He didn't want to startle her, so he placed the tray quietly on the small table near her bed. Emily turned and looked at him, not with fear, but with calm eyes. He smiled gently. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said softly. She didn't reply, but she didn't turn away either. Max barked once, breaking the silence. Richard laughed quietly. "He's always talking for both of us, isn't he?" That became their new routine. Every morning, Richard brought breakfast himself. He would sit by the window while Emily ate slowly, sometimes feeding Max small pieces of fruit. They didn't talk much, but words were not always needed. Sometimes Richard read from the newspaper. Sometimes he just watched her draw. She drew the same thing she loved: sunlight, trees, birds, and always Max. Days passed, and something beautiful began to grow between them. Something fragile but strong. Richard started unlocking more rooms in the mansion that had been closed for years. The piano room was one of them. It had belonged to Grace. Dust covered the keys, but when he lifted the cover, the scent of the old wood and polish filled the room again. He ran his fingers over the keys and played a few soft notes. The sound was rusty but familiar. Emily, who had followed Max into the room, stopped by the doorway. Her eyes widened when she heard the sound. She walked in slowly, her steps light and unsure. Richard looked up and smiled. "Your mother used to play this for you," he said softly. He began to play a gentle melody, one that Grace had always loved. Emily stood quietly listening. Then, without saying a word, she sat on the floor beside Max and hummed along with the music. Richard's eyes filled with tears as he played. That soft humming. It was the same sound that had once come from Grace's lips when she rocked Emily to sleep. For the first time, the house was filled with life again. The sound of the piano and the quiet humming of his daughter blended perfectly, like two souls finding each other again after years of distance. That evening, Richard decided something important. He went to his office and called the workers who managed the mansion's maintenance. "I want every lock removed," he said firmly. "Every single one. No more closed doors." The workers were surprised, but they obeyed. By sunset, every door in the house was free, including Emily's. When Emily saw the locks being taken away, she didn't understand at first. She stood beside Max, holding his collar lightly. But when she saw Richard watching her with a soft smile, she seemed to realize that something had changed forever. She walked slowly into the hallway and then into the garden, her bare feet touching the wet grass again. Max ran ahead, barking happily, circling her as she explored. Richard followed behind, watching her quietly. The garden looked brighter that day. Butterflies fluttered above the flowers, and the sunlight danced on the small pond. Emily knelt beside the water and touched her reflection. She giggled softly as Max splashed water with his paw. The sound made Richard laugh too, and for the first time in many years his laughter didn't feel forced. It came from the heart. In the days that followed, Richard began to take Emily and Max outside the gates of the mansion. At first it was just short walks in the nearby park. Emily held Max's leash tightly, her eyes darting around nervously, but Max kept her steady. Whenever a loud sound frightened her, Max would nudge her leg or rest his head against her arm until she calmed down. Slowly, the fear began to fade. People in the neighborhood who hadn't seen Richard in years started to notice him again. But this time they didn't whisper about his wealth or his cold attitude. They whispered about something else. How the rich man who never smiled was now seen walking hand in hand with his daughter and a dog by his side. Some even stopped to greet him. He smiled politely, proud and grateful. One morning, Richard took Emily to a small flower shop in town. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman, bent down and smiled warmly at Emily. "Would you like to pick some flowers, dear?" she asked. Emily looked unsure at first, but Max nudged her gently forward. She picked a small bunch of daisies and handed them to her father. He took them with a smile and said softly, "They're beautiful." She nodded, a shy smile appearing on her lips. That moment stayed with him. It was simple, but it meant everything. At night, Richard often sat in the garden thinking. The sky was full of stars and the mansion was no longer silent. He could hear Emily's laughter from her room, Max's paws moving across the hall, and the soft sound of life returning to a place that had been empty for too long. Sometimes he looked up at the stars and whispered, "Grace, she's smiling again." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily came out into the garden holding one of her drawings. She walked up to Richard, Max by her side, and handed him the paper. On it was a picture of 3 figures, a man, a girl, and a dog, standing under the sunlight. Above them was written in small, uneven letters, "Home." Richard stared at it, speechless. His eyes filled with tears. He looked at Emily, who stood there watching him quietly. He knelt down and hugged her gently, not too tight, just enough for her to know it was safe. Max wagged his tail, barking softly as if to say he approved. That night, Richard didn't close a single door in the house. He left the windows open and let the cool air move freely through every room. The mansion that once felt like a prison was now a home full of light, laughter, and the sound of a loyal dog's paws on the floor. In his heart, Richard knew that Max had been more than a pet. He had been a messenger, a reminder of love, loyalty, and second chances. Through Max's eyes, he had seen the truth that fear had hidden from him for so long. Emily didn't need protection from the world. She needed to experience it. She didn't need walls. She needed love and trust. As the stars shone above the quiet house, Richard sat on the porch with Max beside him. Emily was inside, asleep with her sketchbook still in her hands. He looked down at the dog and whispered softly, "You didn't just save her, Max. You saved me too." Max turned his head, looked up at him, and wagged his tail gently. It was a simple moment, just a man, his daughter, and a loyal dog, but it felt like the world had finally become right again. Months passed and life in the Hale mansion continued to change in quiet, beautiful ways. The house that once stood cold and silent now echoed with soft laughter, footsteps, and the happy barks of Max. Morning sunlight streamed through open curtains. The garden bloomed brighter than ever, and the air always smelled of flowers and freshly baked bread. Emily had changed too. She no longer stayed hidden in her room. She walked freely through the house, exploring each corner like it was new. She spent hours in the garden drawing butterflies, trees, and the sky. Her drawings filled the walls of her room, and sometimes she even gave them to her father, who kept every single one of them in a leather folder. Max followed her everywhere, his tail wagging like a metronome of joy. Richard often stood by the window watching them. Every time he saw Emily laugh, a wave of gratitude filled his heart. He couldn't believe how far they had come. The man who once believed control was safety had learned that love was the only real protection a parent could give. He thought of Grace often, but now when he remembered her, he smiled instead of feeling pain. He felt sure that she would be proud of them, of Emily's growth, of his change, and of Max, the dog that had silently repaired what fear had broken. One evening, while they were having dinner together, Emily suddenly placed her hand on her father's and pointed toward a drawing she had made earlier that day. It showed a big building with children playing outside and a dog in the center. "What's this?" Richard asked softly, smiling. Emily looked at him and said one word very clearly: help. It was such a simple word, but it stayed with him. That night he sat in his study long after Emily had gone to bed. The rain tapped gently against the windows and Max lay quietly near his feet. Richard stared at her drawing again and thought about what it meant. Emily had found happiness again because someone had understood her. Maybe now it was time to share that same understanding with others. The next morning, he made a decision that would change not only their lives but also the lives of many families who had children like Emily. He called a few people, doctors, teachers, and therapists, and shared his plan. He wanted to build a small therapy and learning center for children with autism, a place where they could feel safe, express themselves freely, and learn in ways that made sense to them, and he wanted to name it the Emily Center. When the workers came to begin construction on the empty land next to the mansion, Emily stood by the fence with Max, watching with excitement. She didn't understand every detail, but she knew something special was happening. Every day she watched the walls rise higher, the rooms take shape, and the garden grow wide and colorful. When the center finally opened months later, it was everything Richard had dreamed of. The building was bright and welcoming, with wide windows that let sunlight fill every corner. The walls were painted in soft color, light blue, gentle yellow, and warm white. There were playrooms, art corners, reading spots, and a small garden filled with flowers where children could run freely. But the most special part of the center wasn't the building. It was Max. He became the heart of the place. The children loved him instantly. Some of them were shy and didn't talk much, but when Max sat beside them, their faces lit up. They would pet his fur, laugh when he rolled over, and whisper things to him that they couldn't say to anyone else. Richard often watched this from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. Max wasn't just Emily's dog anymore. He belonged to everyone. He brought comfort to children who were afraid, hope to parents who were tired, and joy to the staff who worked there. Everyone called him Dr. Max, even though he wore no white coat, just a small blue scarf around his neck with his name embroidered on it. Emily thrived in this new world. She had her own small art studio at the center where she taught children how to draw and paint. Though she didn't speak much, her gentle ways made everyone feel calm around her. She would show them how to mix colors, draw sunshine, or paint their feelings. Sometimes she painted Max sitting under a tree or sleeping near her feet. Her paintings began to decorate the hallways of the center, turning the place into a home of color and peace. Richard found new purpose too. He became involved in helping other families understand autism. He hosted small gatherings where parents could share their stories and fears. He often told them about his mistakes, how he had once locked his daughter away out of fear, believing he was protecting her. He spoke openly, without shame, because he wanted others to learn what he had learned the hard way, that understanding is stronger than fear, and love is more powerful than control. The story of the Emily Center began to spread through the city. Newspapers wrote about it, calling it a place built by love. People from faraway towns came to visit. They met Emily, quiet but full of light, and Max, the loyal dog who seemed to understand every heart that entered the building. Some families came with tears and left with smiles. Children who once couldn't speak began to express themselves through art, music, or simply laughter. One day, during the anniversary celebration of the center, Richard stood on the stage in front of all the families, teachers, and children. Emily stood beside him, holding Max's leash. He looked at everyone and said in a calm voice, "A few years ago, I built walls to keep the world away from my daughter. But it was love and this dog that showed me how wrong I was. Today, I want to thank my daughter, Emily, for teaching me the meaning of real courage, and Max for showing me what loyalty truly is." The crowd clapped warmly. Max barked once as if answering, and everyone laughed. Emily smiled shyly, looking up at her father with proud eyes. After the ceremony, Richard sat under the big oak tree outside the center, watching the children play. The sky was blue and the air smelled of spring. Emily sat a few feet away, painting quietly while Max lay beside her, his head resting on his paws. Richard closed his eyes and let the peaceful sounds fill him. Laughter, footsteps, the rustle of leaves. He remembered the day when his house had been silent, when Emily had been locked away and his heart had been full of fear. It felt like a different lifetime. Now everything had changed. The silence had turned into music. The guilt had turned into gratitude. and the walls had turned into open doors. As the sun began to set, Richard looked at his daughter and whispered, "You saved me, sweetheart." Emily didn't look up, but she smiled softly as if she had heard him. That night, after everyone had gone home, Richard locked the center's gates and walked slowly back to the mansion with Max by his side. The moonlight guided their steps. When they reached the house, Emily was already asleep. He stood by her door for a moment, watching her peaceful face, and whispered softly, "Thank you, Grace. You would be proud of her." And of him. He looked down at Max, who wagged his tail once and then lay down near Emily's bed. Richard turned off the light and walked to his room, leaving the doors open, every single one of them. The house was no longer just a mansion. It was a living memory, a symbol of love, healing, and the power of understanding. Years later, people still spoke about the Hale family, not for their money or their mansion, but for their kindness. And at the center, children still painted, laughed, and played with Max's picture hanging on the wall. It showed him sitting proudly beside Emily, both looking out toward the sunlight. Beneath the painting, a simple line was written, "He freed her heart," and in doing so, freed us all. And in that quiet truth, their story lived forever, a story of a father who found love again, a daughter who learned to shine, and a loyal German shepherd who reminded the world that compassion can change everything.